If it's offensive to you, I won't insist on keeping you, though I'd like very much to see precisely you at my side now. In any case, I thank you very much for your acquaintance and flattering attention, but if you're afraid. Excuse me, Nastasia Philippovna, the general cried in a fit of chivalrous magnanimity, to whom are you talking? I'll stay beside you now out of devotion alone, and if, for instance, there is any danger, what's more, I confess, I'm extremely curious. My only concern was that they might ruin the rugs or break something, and we could do very well without them, in my opinion, Nastasia Philippovna. Rogozhin himself, announced Ferdishchenko. What do you think, Afanasy Ivanovitch? The general managed to whisper quickly, hasn't she gone out of her mind? Without any allegory, that is, in a real, medical sense, eh? I told you, she has always been inclined to it, Afanasy Ivanovitch slyly whispered back. And the fever along with it. Rogozhin's company was almost the same as earlier that day, the only additions were some little old libertine, once the editor of a disreputable scandal sheet, of whom the anecdote went around that he had pawned and drunk up his gold teeth, and a retired lieutenant, decidedly the rival and competitor, in his trade and purpose, of the gentleman with the fists earlier, who was totally unknown to any of Rogozhin's people, but who had been picked up in the street, on the sunny side of Nevsky Prospect, where he was stopping passers-by and asking, in Marlinsky's style, 42 for financial assistance, under the perfidious pretext that in his time he himself used to give petitioners 15 rubles. The two competitors had immediately become hostile to each other. The earlier gentleman with the fists even considered himself offended, once the petitioner was accepted into the company and, being taciturn by nature, merely growled now and then like a bear and looked with profound scorn upon the fawning and facetiousness of the petitioner, who turned out to be a worldly and politic man. By the looks of him, the lieutenant promised to succeed in the business more by adroitness and dodging than by strength, being also of smaller stature than the fist gentleman. Delicately, without getting into an obvious argument, but boasting terribly, he had already hinted more than once at the advantages of English boxing. In short, He turned out to be a pure westernizer. 43 At the word boxing, the fist gentleman merely smiled scornfully and touchily, and without condescending, for his part, to an obvious debate with his rival, displayed now and then, silently, as if accidentally, or, better to say, exposed to view now and then, a perfectly national thing, a huge fist, sinewy, gnarled, overgrown with a sort of reddish fuzz, and everyone could see clearly that if this profoundly national thing were aptly brought down on some object, there would be nothing left but a wet spot. Again, as earlier, none of them was loaded to the utmost degree, thanks to the efforts of Rogozhin himself, who all day had kept in view his visit to Nastasia Philippovna. He himself had managed to sober up almost completely, but on the other hand he was nearly befuddled from all the impressions he had endured on that outrageous day, unlike any other day in his life. Only one thing remained constantly in view for him, in his memory and in his heart, every minute, every moment. For this one thing he had spent the whole time from 5 o'clock in the afternoon till 11, in boundless anguish and anxiety, dealing with the Kinders and Biskups, who also nearly went out of their minds, rushing about like mad on his business. And yet, all the same, they had managed to raise the 100,000 in cash, which Nastasia Philippovna had hinted at in passing, mockingly and quite vaguely, at an interest which even Biskup himself, out of modesty, discussed with Kinder not aloud but only in a whisper. As earlier, Rogozhin marched in ahead of them all, the rest advancing behind him, fully aware of their advantages, but still somewhat cowardly. Above all, and God knows why, they felt cowardly towards Nastasia Philippovna. Some of them even thought they would immediately be chucked down the stairs. Among those who thought so, incidentally, was that fop and heartbreaker's Alyoshev. But the others, and most of all the fist gentlemen, not aloud but in their hearts, regarded Nastasia Philippovna with the profoundest contempt and even hatred, and went to her as to a siege. But the magnificent decor of the first two rooms, things they had never seen or heard of, rare furniture, paintings, an enormous statue of Venus, all this produced in them an irresistible impression of respect and even almost of fear. This, of course, prevented none of them from squeezing gradually and with insolent curiosity, despite their fear, into the drawing-room behind Rogojin, but when the fifth gentleman, the petitioner, and some of the others noticed General Epanchin among the guests, they were at first so taken aback that they even began retreating slowly into the first room. Lebedev alone was among the most emboldened and convinced, and marched in almost on a par with Rogojin, having grasped the actual meaning of 1,400,000 in capital and of 100,000 now, right here, in the hand. It must be noted, however, that none of them, not even the all-knowing Lebedev, were quite certain in their knowledge of the extent and limits of their power and whether indeed everything was now permitted them or not. There were moments when Lebedev could have sworn it was everything, but at other moments he felt an uneasy need to remind himself, just in case, of certain encouraging and reassuring articles of the legal code. On Rogojin himself, Nastasia Philippovna's drawing room made the opposite impression from that of all his companions. As soon as the door curtain was raised and he saw Nastasia Philippovna, all the rest ceased to exist for him, as it had in the afternoon, even more powerfully than in the afternoon. He turned pale and stopped for a moment. One could surmise that his heart was pounding terribly. Timidly and like a lost man he gazed at Nastasia Philippovna for several seconds, not taking his eyes off her. Suddenly, as if he had lost all reason and nearly staggering, he went up to the table. On his way he bumped into Tin's chair and stepped with his huge, dirty boots on the lace trimming of the silent German beauty's magnificent light blue dress. He did not apologize and did not notice. Having gone up to the table, he placed on it a strange object, with which he had also entered the drawing room, holding it out in front of him with both hands. It was a big stack of paper, about 5 inches high and 7 inches long, wrapped firmly and closely in the Stock Market Gazette, and tied very tightly on all sides and twice crisscross with the kind of string used for tying sugar loaves. Then he stood without saying a word, his arms hanging down, as if awaiting his sentence. He was dressed exactly as earlier, except for the brand new silk scarf on his neck, bright green and red, with an enormous diamond pin shaped like a beetle, and the huge diamond ring on the dirty finger of his right hand. Lebedev stopped within 3 steps of the table, the rest, as was said, gradually accumulated in the drawing room. Katya and Pasha, Nastasia Philippovna's maids, also came running and watched from under the raised door curtain with deep amazement and fear. "What is this?" asked Nastasia Philippovna, looking Rogozhin over intently and curiously, and indicating the object with her eyes. "The 100,000. He replied almost in a whisper. "Ah, so he's kept his word, just look." "Sit down, please, here, right here on this chair, I'll tell you something later." "Who is with you? The whole company from before?" "Well, let them come and sit down, there on the sofa is fine, and on the other sofa. The 2 armchairs there, what's the matter with them, don't they want 2? Indeed, some were positively abashed, retreated, and sat down to wait in the other room, but others stayed and seated themselves as they were invited to do, only further away from the table, more in the corners, some still wishing to efface themselves somewhat, others taking heart somehow unnaturally quickly, and the more so the further it went. Rogozhin also sat down on the chair shown him, but did not sit for long. He soon stood up and did not sit down again. He gradually began to make out the guests and look around at them. Seeing Ganya, he smiled venomously and whispered to himself, "So there." He looked without embarrassment and even without any special curiosity at the general and Afanasy Ivanovitch, but when he noticed the prince beside Nastasia Philippovna, he could not tear his eyes from him for a long time, being extremely astonished and as if unable to explain this encounter to himself. One might have suspected that there were moments when he was actually delirious. Besides the shocks of that day, he had spent the whole previous night on the train and had not slept for almost 2 days. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is 100,000, said Nastasia Philippovna, addressing them all with some sort of feverishly impatient defiance, here in this dirty packet. Earlier today he shouted like a madman that he would bring me 100,000 in the evening, and I've been waiting for him. He was bargaining for me. He started at 18,000, then suddenly jumped to 40, and then to this 100 here. He has kept his word. Pa, how pale he is.